Coronavirus has presented new and unique challenges, which we could not have conceived about even a few months ago. As professionals and organizations, we've had to rethink almost everything, and quickly. Everything has changed, which means we have to do things differently. And these webinars are our way of trying to create a shared learning space to begin to think about ways of doing things differently. All of us here on this panel, but also in the audience, all of us are learning too. And while at times that can be incredibly painful and uncomfortable and frustrating, what it can also give birth to is innovation. And if we are open to learning, if we are open to doing things differently, we can continue to work safely, sensitively, and attentively with the most vulnerable children and families in our society. This is a new experience for us as panelists, creating a shared learning space. And we're hopeful that this will give rise to further shared learning experiences with professionals. So the way in which we have organized this for today and for tomorrow is that each of our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes, after which time we will open the floor to the participants who have questions or comments. So we ask all of you to mute yourselves now and to turn off your videos until it comes time for the question time, at which point you can raise your hand or you can write a question in the comment box. At the discussion time, all of us will be able to think together about answering some of the questions. We've sent a lot of rules, if you like, today, but they are the number of rules that we thought would be quite helpful. Number one being that at least one of the things of having to work remotely is understanding that actually you can be overheard. And safeguarding starts at home. So if there are children around who you think may be able to hear things that you think, is not appropriate for them, you may consider wanting to put in some headphones. Our first speaker is Gemma Hadridge, who is a registered social worker. She has worked across a range of settings in health and social care services and currently works as a therapist at the Early Years Parenting Unit, which is a multi-family assessment and treatment service for parents with personality difficulties and their children who are on the edge of care. Gemma is a training in mentalization-based therapy and is currently completing the advanced MBT supervision to become an accredited practitioner. She also works as a therapist, using her therapy principles in order to work with vulnerable children and families. I'm going to hand over to you now, Gemma, so that you can start to talk about some of the experiences you have had working under lockdown.
Great, thank you, Nicola. Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Nicola mentioned, I work at the Early Years Parenting Unit, which means that on our day one of going into lockdown, we went from a 2-day-a-week therapeutic community where we work 5.5 hours a day with different families at the same time, offering groups, individual sessions, parent-child work, childcare whilst the parents are in those groups, into nothing. And we had to very quickly, as everyone did, work out what can we offer, because although we work closely alongside statutory services, we were not key workers. We were doing the work, but we were not the people that were able to do home visits in the way we would have. And so very quickly, within hours, we started off by creating new crisis plans with the family and also new contact plans, because what worked before would be different. So initially we made sure that we asked all the families we work with, what social media do you already use? The types of families we work with don't have the financial budget, whether it's the technology or the use of credit and internet, to be able to just assume they'd have access to laptops, have access to phones that were actually working well enough to use video. And so ensuring that we were using something at first that they felt comfortable with, whilst also discussing with them the data implications. So making sure they knew that even though WhatsApp says it's all encrypted and private, it's not that simple and straightforward. Ensuring that when we were at points using Zoom, we made sure we did things like locking the room. And now we're using Teams as our way of holding meetings on the unit. And this is what we've seen over the time, over the last 3 months. Really, over this kind of time, we've seen some surprising benefits. Although we do home visits, we would never have been in the home twice a week. We never would have been literally seeing the routine, because although we spend time with them at meals, having lunches, actually knowing the routine throughout the day, not just the days they're with us, has been really helpful for us to think with the parents. What does a day in your life look like? And how can we think about this and the impact it has on your children? It also surprised us with some of the benefits where some of the parents that struggled with the intensity of individual work, sitting in a room with us, being asked to open up about things that they found really difficult, whether in regards to their mental health or their parenting, the distance, when it was made explicit, actually meant we had different conversations that we'd not had before. It appeared to be a less threatening, a relational space by being in their own home. And we also have had some really interesting experiences that, having spoken with other services, we've heard about actually the use of phone as a different way of observing children together. And actually that can be beneficial. So there was one time I was speaking with one of the mums I work with, and I could hear the children in the background. So I asked her to spin off of selfie mode into the other mode so we could both see the same thing. And we had a moment talking about her children that we have never had before, even though we do video work, even though I'm with her children those 11 hours a week at least. There was something about us having the same observational stance. Literally, I was seeing what she was seeing, that created something that meant we were able to talk about her children and their emotional experiences, just us watching them play, in a way that was very different. We also found, and have been very pleased to hear, that when we hold community meetings in our unit, we know they're fundamental and important. And when we built that into the virtual way of working, the families have really enjoyed it. That doesn't mean it's easy, but actually for very isolated families still coming together, even though it's this disjointed way where the children are screaming, they actually still singing hello to each other, being able to connect with one another, and as parents saying, you know what, I found this really hard, or sharing resources they found, not just from us as professionals, but parent to parent. We were able to try in many ways, it's not the same, but many ways, build on those kind of important structures we have in place at the EYPU. But it's also been really difficult. We as a team have felt so much more helpless. We aren't able to intervene in the same way. So when a parent's struggling, when we know them, we can see them, but we aren't able to say, you know what, go have a cup of tea and I'll look after the kid for a second. Or we see the child struggling and we can't, in ways that we do, which I recognise is different in other services, but we can't go and be with them and play with them in that. It's a different disconnect, and it varies with children on their age about how this works. Some you might be able to build a better, different relationship virtually, and others it's too much being with you in this virtual space. And so it does mean sitting with even more uncertainty, which I'll go on to in a minute. And it does mean less monitoring. We know that. These are the facts. And this is why we thought it's really important to come together and think as a varied group of professionals about what's it like now, what's it been like, but also what are we going to do when this is over? Because I know that social workers are able to do more. I know services are reopening, but we're still in a place where practitioners might be having to self-isolate. There might be ways that the kind of therapeutic roles won't be open as soon as some of the statutory and education roles, and thinking about that merge of this. And as I got something from Aaron Ballick, who's talking tomorrow, that I thought was really helpful, even with the benefits, this isn't the functional equivalence of doing face-to-face work. So there might be benefits, but we cannot lose that there is also something different. I'm just going to briefly explain about some of the things that I found in the contact itself. I don't normally have this background when I'm working with families. This is my professional background for team meetings. But when I do work with families, I have something much more neutral. But already day one, I thought I'd always have a blank wall. I always thought I'd be in the same place. And it became clear quite quickly, my flat does not allow for that. And also, the children I work with are too interested. So one of the children I work with, who's 5, we spent 3 weeks working out whether we could even do video or audio calls because it was too much for him. He was so annoyed he could not see my flat. He could not, where I lived, because he was showing me. So why on earth could I not show him? And actually, it also took a lot from the families, because we're talking about families that struggle, at least we are, to contain their children's emotions. So it meant we were having to really focus on containing. Our sessions weren't able to be the same therapy they were before. There's a therapeutic element of it by being containing in your nature, but it meant the topics we've been talking about are very different. And at times I feel like a children's entertainer. I've got my guitar out, I've got books out, things I would not normally do because I'd just be myself in person, but ways to try and be with the child. I know my colleague's done a cooking lesson where she's had the family set the iPad up and shown the mum a different way of cooking a slightly healthier pasta sauce. I know a colleague who's been taken on a walk around the local park. And these are things we did not have in our minds at the beginning. These are things that have evolved. And it's the reliance on this co-creation, especially when you work with families that don't want to work with you, that is so much more difficult, but powerful when it works. The mum that took my colleague around in the park does not always get on with us. She struggles to hear us talking about the concerns. But actually, we were one of the only people in this really isolating time that was wanting to be with her, was able to be with her. And there's a change in that relationship with her and her therapist that I'm not sure we would have seen in the same way without this experience. So really the focus has been on connection, keeping a relationship, trying to build these moments of joy and connection in a very different way. Like I said, being a children's presenter and being rejected quite quickly when I don't sing Baby Shark very well with my guitar, and never doing that again because I got too embarrassed. But I tried it. And knowing actually that simple works. With the children I'm working with now, we have sing-song at least once a week. That's what we do. And sometimes it lasts 30 seconds because the TV's on in the background and the parents have struggled to help them to be in that place with us. And other times it's gone on for 15, 20 minutes, which for 2-year-olds on a virtual bit of technology, that's the kind of thing that we're having to hold on to, which is so different from being with them for, like I said, at least 11 hours a week, and recognizing our limitations, which then leads me to how much we have to work with other agencies. And I know we do already. I know we all knew this, but having to so explicitly check in with each other to make sure we're not all calling them on the same day. So having plans of who calls who when, ensuring that we know, we work very closely with social workers. How does the social worker want to be updated? Brief little updates after every call, or a weekly summary? Because actually it feels different when we've all got loads of emails. It might be that way of communicating's changed with professionals too. And really, it just reiterates the importance of this multi-agency working and the reliance for not just monitoring, but the intervention, the loss of school, the loss of nursery, both for the children and what it means as respite for families, especially the families we work with where they really struggle with prioritising their children's needs and their own mental health. And the reliance they had on these things that have just been taken away. Just briefly before I end, I think also the thing that we've been talking about a lot as a team and also in other networks that I'm part of, what this feels like for us. So I've mentioned the change I've had in my complete neutral stance that I imagined, which would have meant I was in a corner, hunched up and really uncomfortable, and realising I need to be able to sit okay. I need to be able to have breaks between meetings, to be able to turn off selfie mode when I can, when I'm not on Teams, so I don't have to see myself talking, even if I try not to look. It's unnatural, these little tricks, but also recognising the importance of boundaries when all boundaries are lost. We're sitting in our home talking with people that would never even hear about our home, let alone see our home, even if it is blank walls. I know in our team, we all have different coloured walls. And what did that mean for them, seeing the different coloured walls we have, let alone other things that happen where we're sharing spaces with family or friends? And also that shared experience with the families. For us, through mentalizing, we will talk about our emotions and share our emotional experiences, but we wouldn't share much about our personal lives. But we all know we're in lockdown together. We all are in something together that unified us with these families in a different way than has ever happened before as well. And the importance as a team to have our informal WhatsApp group where we can text and go, is anyone free? I need a chat. And we know that someone will respond as quickly as possible. Ways of increasing our check-ins, making sure they're brief though, because they overran at first, because we were offloading more. So ensuring there's that brief check-in, maybe at the beginning and end of day, but also those informal spaces that you don't get when you're not in an office and you can't just turn to your colleague. And although we recognise that there's things that are made more explicit that can make this better, because we have to be clearer in what we're saying, it doesn't mean that we're able to respond in the same way. And again, just what we're left with when we're sitting then in our room after a difficult call, knowing I'm in my living room, they're in their living room, but gosh, that's not how I would have responded if we were in the same room together in person. And so just briefly, some of the things and a general that I think we found helpful, but I'd love to know what other people think, and I'm looking forward to hearing Denise and Ellie and Sarah talking as well, is we now do planned short calls. We're trying to not make them too long. That's a way we've noticed to be able to contain them more often, but really explaining why we're doing it more often. Making sure that focus is on containing both the parent and the child in the call. There is no point in having a long call if that isn't the focus of it. Not only are we doing something in the moment that's risky, we're then leaving both parent and child afterwards without our containing presence in whatever that would look like normally. Again, the intensity for all of us, both the families we work with and us as practitioners, and the importance of multi-agency working. And this will happen for the next few years. I spoke to someone yesterday and they said, we're going to see signs of this for 5 years. Even if this all stops now, this is a longer term implication. And then how we can support all networks, being able to speak with the families about those extended networks in case they get ill, or the ways that you can manage it in a different way when they can't just go over to their friend's house in the same way. So I just want to end on the fact that we know that there's a decrease in social services referrals. We know that's because of the importance of multi-agency working, being able to intervene together, to be able to monitor together. And we know it isn't because there's a decrease in children and families and adults experiencing harm and trauma at the moment. So we know this is slightly a waiting game, waiting to see what's going to happen when schools reopen, when services reopen, but also wanting to, just seeing, sorry, Sarah and Ellie respond to that, which implies I might have hit a nerve for social workers who will speak in a minute. But knowing this is about holding something, having to wait for something and stabilizing something. It isn't going to be stable at the moment, but there's something we can do to think about working with, trying to stabilize it as a staff team, as practitioners, but also for the families we work with, because there is so much uncertainty for them at the moment. And on that really not very containing note, I think I'm going to end and pass back to you now, Nicola.
Thanks very much, Gemma. You know, it makes me think very much about something I read very recently, actually, from a therapeutic social worker in Leeds who said, you know, we have a sense that sometimes the most meaningful thing we can offer at this unprecedented time of pain and uncertainty is a holding, stabilizing space, a space where feelings can be validated within a relationship built on trust, consistency, and predictability, and the promise that we will still be there on the other side if we are still needed. And that is no mean feat, holding and creating and holding that stabilizing, containing space. Right, let's move on to Sarah Jones and Ellie Gita, who are both highly experienced social workers working in the London Borough of Hackney. Sarah, works in child protection and looked after areas of social work. She manages a very large caseload, averaging 25 children with varying degrees of need and risk, who are on child protection plans, child in need plans, care orders at home, supervision orders, as well as looked after children. As part of her work as a social worker, Sarah is required to give evidence in court as part of care proceedings in relation to children. She's also a social work practice educator and is training as a systemic practitioner. Ellie, Gita, who also works in Hackney, has worked for a number of years as a social worker and looked after children's unit in Hackney, and has been based in the Child in Need service at Hackney, working with families in the context of care proceedings, child in need plans and child protection plans since 2016. Ellie manages staff within the SIN services and has done so since 2017, and currently manages a much larger unit since 2019. And they're both going to talk together in conversation about their experiences of their work during this pandemic. Over to you.
So I'm Ellie.
I'm Sarah.
So I guess we thought it would be helpful just to have a conversation about the reality of our work and what our work is looking like on a day-to-day basis, and how that's different to early March, I suppose what that may look like in the future. So just to give a very brief overview, in our unit at the moment, I have just over 100 children allocated to me, and there are 5 social workers in the unit, of which Sarah is one. So Sarah does that kind of the more direct work with the families. I do have a family that I work directly with, but I have more of a kind of overview. So I suppose I wanted to ask you, Sarah, what do you think has been the thing that surprised you most about this lockdown period?
I think obviously as social workers we do adapt, and with kind of change, new opportunities kind of do arise on the back of that. But for me, I think initially I was just kind of panicking, thinking, how am I going to manage these risky cases and kind of put in the kind of right measures that needs to be put in place. But kind of getting back to your question, for me, I think I'm just kind of shocked by how much we can kind of take from this and hopefully use as a positive. So for instance, kind of even things like how meetings now, we can do them virtually, we can do telephone conferences. I reflect back on kind of as a social worker, your day is kind of back to back with visits, meetings, whereas I'm kind of thinking now that takes up less time because you're not travelling to the other side of the country or a couple of hours on the tube. So for me, that's been quite helpful.
Do you feel that that gives you more space to think? You know, because I guess something that, you know, when I hear about that, about it's being so busy and it's back to back, I suppose then you think, where is the time to really think about these families? Where is our space to reflect and kind of just go beyond the tick box of, you know, this is the CP plans that we need to have done? You know, do you feel that you do have more space to kind of think more about the kind of the complexity of the families in a different way?
Such a good question. I think as well with kind of working from home, you've got to get a balance of not exactly booking meetings back to back and then you don't have the space to think. I think obviously you do lose that sense even after a meeting. Often kind of previously I'd maybe pull a professional to the side saying, how do you think that went? What do you think about this comment that was made? So I guess in that sense, yes, you do kind of lose that. However, I have found useful, for instance, our kind of unit meetings and how kind of now we check in most days. So that's kind of good opportunity for that. But yeah, I guess it's a balance, like you said. In some ways you do lose quite a bit of that.
So does it feel like you're working in a more isolated way than maybe it would have felt pre-lockdown? You know, do you feel, because I suppose when I think about my role and what it's like for me, I feel like I'm making more decisions without having space to really talk them through and explore them. So, you know, it's that thing even of just picking up the phone, you know, I think to myself, is it necessary to pick up the phone and talk this through with somebody else? Or can I just make this decision? And I think, you know, obviously we're safe, but I'm making more decisions kind of, you know, back to back than I would be, I think, pre-lockdown. And that can lead, I think, you know, for me, that can feel quite an isolating experience at times, and certainly holding a lot of responsibility, a lot of weight for the decisions that I make. And I guess I wonder for you, do you feel that, you know, having less of a active professional network in the same way?
Yeah, because even things like in the office, the physical space, for instance, I might go over to you and ask you a question and then say, oh, what about this case and what about this case? And it's like you said, actually working from home. You might think, oh, do I need to, is it worth kind of ringing you up, or do I make a decision myself? So I do agree with you in that sense.
I suppose something that I've also thought about is it is how we hold that risk and how we hold that anxiety, because I feel like I'm holding more uncertainty than than we would have been under normal working kind of circumstances. So even when I talk think about the families that I work directly with, sometimes I'll call, there's a particular mum who I call, and she's been much more difficult to get hold of recently on the phone, and when I put the phone down, I'm left with that feeling of like, oh my goodness, what has happened? Is she okay? Is she not okay? Is she not answering the phone because actually she's trying to manage 2 children and possibly do some working and trying to get her food shopping and thinking about her mum who's not well? Or is she not answering the phone because she's being avoidant? And it's that, or is there something really wrong? Is she not safe? It's that kind of, there's very little space to think. I don't know, there's no, I can't call up the school and say, school, have you seen, how do the kids seem to you? Or health visitor, how do the kids seem to you? Because no one is seeing these families. So it feels like a lot of uncertainty that we are having to hold and try to make safe decisions with.
And you lose that kind of that gut instinct when you kind of, even just before you knock on the door, you kind of can see, what's going on. Are the curtains open? Are they up and ready? Even when you walk into the home, does it smell of fresh laundry? Does it smell of cannabis? Have they been cooking? Even little things like that, you lose that. And I guess when you do a video call, you can ask for a tour of the house, or can you see a certain room? But even that feels unnatural, and obviously people can miss bits out. I had a mum a couple of weeks ago that I spoke to, and she kept turning the video towards the ceiling and she wouldn't show me her face. And then I was wondering, has her face been injured? Is there a reason why she doesn't want to show me her face? We did have that conversation, but I guess it's not as natural. It makes things a little bit more difficult, as if it's you need to check this and this, and it's the balance sometimes during them calls as well. Like, what do I ask? I want to try and keep them engaged, but then there's lots of other things I want to ask about as well.
I suppose that really makes me think about something you were saying with one particular family, where it actually feels really difficult to have difficult conversations, because parents can disengage very easily if they want to. They can just stop answering your calls. And I suppose now that the restrictions have been lifted somewhat, we can go out more regularly if we need to, or do more doorstep visits and things. But I suppose it feels like a much, to me, it feels like a much more fine balance about, actually how do we have these tricky conversations but keep this parent answering the phone to me? How can we continue to see this child? Because that's ultimately why we're calling parents. We want to see how the child is, but how can we keep them safe without answering difficult questions? So many things we're trying to balance all at the same time.
Absolutely. So with that particular case that you're referring to, I've almost had to kind of ration out and think, what are the most important risk areas that I need to discuss during this call, and think about that, because as you say, with that particular parent, if I address every single area of risk that I have, she would put the phone down and completely disengage. So sometimes with that family, it's just been a case of checking that the children are alive, that they're okay, that they've got no bruises, trying to utilise the school as much as possible. But that's been so difficult.
And I suppose, something that I think, so Gemma spoke about this, about creativity and about how actually we can get contact with those, with those families who are more difficult to get hold of, or where we have those bigger worries. There is some real creative stuff I know you've done around actually getting schools on board for those children that are attending schools. So you've been doing video calls to schools.
So we were just kind of reflecting on this before. It had a really kind of positive video call last week where I got to see the children and kind of see how they was interacting with other classmates, and how those kind of even kind of in their like development, writing and kind of playing, etc. I could see that,
and those things you wouldn't usually see at home.
And I think for me that I kind of thought going forward, why have I not done this before? I guess you wouldn't.
We're learning.
And you would normally kind of go in person. But I guess even when hopefully we can do more face-to-face visits, that's maybe something that I can do kind of in between. But like you said, definitely I saw a different side of the children that I wouldn't usually see. Even if I was there in person, I was kind of reflecting how perhaps they would have acted differently, whereas with technology, the thing is, a lot of children are used to technology, aren't they? They're used to phones. So thinking about what Gemma said as well about creativity, I was kind of reflecting how even a lot of the children that I speak to, they seem so comfortable because they've often got iPads and they want to kind of grab the phone and speak to you.
And do you feel that there has, I suppose, we do this because ultimately it's about the children and how we can, build relationships with them and try and think about how we can best keep them safe and make sure they're happy. And I mean, do you feel that this has created a different relationship with any of your children? You know, has that been, do you feel more worried about your children or less, or is it not as simple as that?
I think it's not as simple as that. I think as well, I just wanted to link to what Gemma was saying before about kind of the technology as well, and how some people respond well to that, but actually some families and parents don't know how to use Zoom, they don't know how to use the apps, etc. And I think we was having a discussion before about a lot of teenagers, how some of them feel really comfortable using FaceTime or video calls so we can check in about risk and see how they are, but then some completely don't want to use that.
Yeah, I suppose if they're feeling self-conscious, they don't want their kind of their, you know, it's that thing of looking back at your face, like I know Jen was speaking about, and I feel that as well. You know, it's like constantly seeing yourself reflected back during your conversations. It's quite a strange experience, and I suppose I wonder what that's like for children, particularly when they're having maybe more difficult conversations with us, you know, about things that they're feeling worried about or painful thoughts or feelings, and then they're looking at their own face, telling us about those things. You know, how do they experience that? I know that also certainly I do feel worried about how we do have difficult conversations when we are then just gone, you know, the phone call ends, and what, you know, that thing of what is it that we're leaving families and children with. And, you know, I suppose we have those difficult conversations and we do leave families with that anyway. But, you know, then they might leave the office and walk down the road, or we might leave the family home but kind of come up with some plan maybe before we leave about, you know, is everyone going to come out, and could the kids walk to the bus stop with me just so we can have some space? And I suppose it's that the very sudden end of communication can feel quite unsafe. And thinking about, you know, risk where we have DV in the home, or where there's physical chastisement and things, it's how we can explore those tricky topics in a way that doesn't end up feeling like, oh, we're just leaving that for the family now, off we go, bye-bye, we've ticked our box and asked our question, and now we're leaving that for you to try to manage.
And I always worry about exacerbating the situation as well. I think what Gemma said before was kind of spot on about obviously making sure kind of the doors closed and kind of reminding people about using technology and privacy. But often as well, when I'm having them conversations with children, quite difficult conversations, I'm mindful as well, is the parent in the background? Like, where are they? Like you said, where do we leave them afterwards with that?
It's quite a scary way of working, I think. You know, I think it certainly, I feel when I think about normally I think like I know the children in our unit, I feel like I know them really well, I know the family situations really well, I can sort of, I have, like you spoke about, a gut feeling about how things might be going, and I guess because I'm further removed from the families, but ultimately am making some of the decisions, it's a very difficult way of working, and I think we are learning and we're adapting to it. And for example, having in our unit, having more regular meetings as a team, you know, twice a week or 3 times a week, helps to build up that kind of knowledge and day-to-day experience of the children. But it's a real slow period, I think, of adaptation, and we're maybe just about moving towards something that feels slightly safer, and then the goalposts change again because the lockdown restrictions change, and you know, it's such a moving picture, I suppose. It's how can we constantly be adapting to try to make things safe and to make our work effective. Challenge.
I just kind of was going to add about, even like when you're going on the visit, it's kind of somebody's face and their presentation, and how I was reflecting on a visit I had a couple of weeks ago where I said to the parent straight away, are you okay? Like, you don't look well. And then she disclosed about a serious incident that had happened. And I was kind of thinking, if that was over the phone, I wouldn't have seen her face. And I don't know if actually she would have disclosed that. And I suppose for me, it's reflecting about, and how do you work with using technology? You can cover things, you can kind of say everything's okay, you've got that barrier.
Yeah, there's something about that face to face. It's certainly when I've been doing the CP visits for the unit, when our unit members haven't been able to because they're unwell or further away, I've walked away from visits feeling like, oh, thank goodness, I'm so pleased I've seen that family face to face. I'm so pleased that, you know, I've just got a more tangible sense of what's going on, and I just haven't got that so much in some of those video calls, particularly where I don't work directly with the family and know that family as well. You just can't, something about that face to face is just so important, isn't it, I think? And it's very difficult to supplement that with these virtual methods and ways of working.
That makes me think a bit, actually, both of that you're both talking really about what Gemma was talking about. It's not the functional equivalent of the technology. But one of the things that I thought, you know, I think all of us on this panel, but also the participants are saying, why did I not do that before? And I really like the way you said that, Sarah. But it strikes me, how can you, when you're frightened, when what you're doing is look, all I can do at the moment is wonder if they've got bruises or they're still alive. That actually in that kind of anxiety, that kind of really up against it, the capacity for creativity is diminished. And that as we start to talk and form networks with people, that you do something that is rather wonderful, I thought, which was go into that classroom with the technology and you start to develop new ways of starting to monitor, assess and engage with these children. Thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting. And I really enjoyed the to and fro of the discussion between you two, because it raised so many issues that I think we certainly as a team have grappled with, but I'm almost certain the participants are going to be having lots of bells rung for them as well. Thank you very much. We now move on to Dr. Denise Turner, who's an experienced registered social worker and currently works as a senior lecturer in social work at London Metropolitan University. Prior to the pandemic, Denise's research interests encompass digital practices and death and dying, which have been amplified by this current COVID-19 pandemic. She was chair of the advisory group for the National Digital Capabilities Project for Social Work, delivered by Sky and Basware. Social workers traditionally viewed it as a risk, for example, safeguarding, in form of a relationship, you have to, screens have always been seen as bad. Technology has been seen as the enemy. But actually being able to start to look at the more positive challenges that I think you and Gemma and Ellie and Sarah are starting to outline. Denise has always been interested and written about digital media, and always been interested in how social media and tech can connect people in positive ways. She has authored a book on parents' experience of the professional response to sudden, unexpected child death, and is currently involved with research focused on death and dying resulting from COVID-19. And I'm going to hand over to you now, Denise.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and it was really interesting to listen to the other speakers. Just picking up on what Nicola said about my interest in digital technology, my doorbell has rung twice very loudly today. So I'm just hoping that nothing happens while I'm talking. But, I think that's the space that we're all in, isn't it? So
Yes.
I've got some slides that I want to share. Once the university lecturer, always the university lecturer, I'm afraid. So thank you very much for inviting me. I just want to share some thoughts, really. I do, as Nicola said, have a background in writing about death and dying, in researching in death and dying, and in thinking about the digital. But I think, as everybody said today, we're all experiencing this in different ways. So I want to share my thoughts and then invite you to share your own at the end. And one of those things is about grief. I picked this up off Twitter. I have my own experiences of loss and grief, as most of us do. And sometimes those experiences are depicted as looking like this. But I think this is much more helpful, actually. And I don't know who this is attributable to, but I picked it up off Twitter. So thank you. I think that actually people's experience of loss and grief very often looks like the diagram on the right. And I suppose that's what I want to think about a bit today. So on the 12th of March, before we went into lockdown, Boris Johnson talked about many families in Britain will lose loved ones before their time, which is an enormous statement from a prime minister. And I just wanted to concentrate there on the word lose. Lose in the English language is very often used synonymously with dying. And you can see these are definitions from the Cambridge Dictionary. To lose is to no longer have something, quite often because you don't know where it is. So your keys or your phone. Death, as you see here, is defined as the end of life. And what I would say is that we've all experienced, as everybody's talked about today already, we've all experienced a lot of loss in the last few weeks. So I think everyone has experienced some form of loss. We won't all have experienced a death, but yet we have been confronted on a daily basis with death actually on an unprecedented scale in this country. We're now at 42,000 deaths and rising. And in England, we're not very good at talking about death. So this is something I think that we've been confronted with in a background culture that's actually very uncomfortable with that. And just to think about that, there was a national survey a couple of years ago, a huge national survey, showed that 18 million people nationwide were extremely uncomfortable with talking about death, and 5 million of those wouldn't talk about their own death. So when we quite rightly talk about things like advanced care planning, those things are hugely important, but we are working in a context where actually people are very uncomfortable. And as I've said, we've now been confronted with an enormous death toll, 42,000, it's gone up since I did these slides. And that's something that's coming into our homes. If we're listening to the daily briefings, if we're listening to media report, it's coming into our homes every day, and that has an effect. Different survey, a report from the Royal College of Physicians called Talking About Dying showed that actually doctors, people working in the medical profession aren't always that comfortable either with talking about death. So, you know, for those people that are carers, for those people that are working in health and social care, it isn't necessarily a conversation that they're comfortable having. And yet again, it's something that we've been confronted with, to use that popular word, in an unprecedented way in modern times. So I wanted to think about loss as well. And to do that, I just picked out these two quotations. This is Peter Maris, who wrote a book about loss and change many hundreds of years ago now, when at the hub of social work training used to be the concepts of loss and change. And my feeling is that they're still hugely important in social work. And obviously we're experiencing huge loss and change at the moment. So Maris, as you can see here, said that our purposes and expectations come to be organised around particular relationships. These relationships are crucial to the way we constitute the meaning of our lives. And the reason I picked that out is because I think it's true, and also because we've had those taken away from us, actually. We've had those significant relationships, the office, you know, the water cooler moments, the things that people have already talked about, the contact that they have with people they work with and people they're working with. All of that has been disrupted. It's like one of those great big snow globes. It's all been thrown up in the air, and we're waiting for it to settle. And I think that's a significant loss in all sorts of different ways. And then similarly, this is Goffman talking about death and dying. And he says that in truth, our rather brief time is ticking away, but we seem to only hold our breath for seconds and minutes of it. And what he's saying there is that we're always busy, you know, always busy, always doing. We don't think about mortality. But as I say, we've suddenly been forced to, in a way that was uninvited. We didn't want this to happen. It's been forced into our lives. And all of a sudden, we've had the time to think about these things. But at the same time, to link to the Maris quote, that the things that constitute the meaning of our lives have also been disrupted. And you know, I think that's really significant. And my view is that we have all lived under some form of collective trauma, which I'll move on to talk about in a minute. So you might sort of constitute death and loss, death as being some form of primary loss. So death is the primary loss that we all experience. It's inevitable. It happens to all of us. Secondary losses, I just made a list here. People will have their own. So the lockdown itself. One of the things I thought about was about visibility as well. So one of the things that we've heard about a lot during the lockdown was about the increase in domestic abuse, because people aren't visible. We're, as we've talked about a lot today, we're in our own homes, we're locked down, we're coming out of that now, but that's been the case for the last few months. Things like funerals and rituals, ways of making meaning out of our experiences we've lost. Work, things like, having to be at home with your children, homeschooling them. One of my neighbours put up a poster in their window that said Ofsted rating bloody awful. As it was almost like a message to the outside world that this is what they were experiencing. And health, actually, I think that, in this country, a lot of the time we take our health for granted. And all of a sudden, that in itself is a disruption to our understanding. We're at threat in a way that many of us have been privileged not to be. There's been a lot also said about physical effects. So there was a study in 2019 that showed that being bored makes you tired. Your brain's not receiving the signals that it needs. So it can't distinguish between inactivity and sleep. So I think that's quite an important thing when we're thinking about children locked down at home, parents having to homeschool or to entertain these children, that actually, there will have been a lot of time which will have hung heavy. And then the inevitable conversation about screens. Everyone knows this. When we stare at screens, we forget to blink. It's bad for our eyes. And there's also something known as the gaze effect, which shows that, inevitably, as today, our behaviour is altered by online communication. We don't communicate in the same ways. And I think people have talked about that already very eruditely today. So I think my sort of contention is that actually we have all experienced a trauma. A trauma is defined as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And I think that, however privileged we have been or not, we have all experienced some form of collective trauma. Neither do I agree with the all in it together thing. I don't think that's true. We all know that deaths have been much higher amongst certain populations and in certain groups. So, some people have experienced this in a much worse way than others. And I think that, and people have already touched on this a lot today, that these effects will continue. They will last. So I wanted to touch just slightly on children and loss because we're with the Anna Freud Centre today, and just to think about that in terms of loss theory. What we say is that children are rehearsing little losses all the way through their lives. So they leave home, they may go to nursery, that's a loss. Being born itself can be constituted as a loss. They move through different classes at school. There is constant loss to them. But actually what we have experienced again at the moment is a way in which children have been confronted with not little losses, but huge losses, actually, and where their parents quite often are struggling as well. And also where they may, Nicola talked about this at the beginning, where they may be overhearing conversations, overhearing stuff on the media where there is a lot of talk about people dying. And depending on the age of the child, that can be quite frightening. So again, that's something that we have to think about. How are children processing this? It's not usual, as I said at the beginning, for us to be talking about dying in the way that we have in England, so in this country certainly. So it's, again, something for us to think about when we're thinking about what children are overhearing and experiencing at the moment. And then I just wanted to touch on really what's already been talked about by Gemma and by our social worker colleagues today, is to also be thinking about professionals that are working in this time. I really love this quotation, so I've put it here. I'm going to read it out, actually. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And I think that's really true. I think we have to think about, as workers, as parents, as people that are carers, in whatever way, looking after ourselves. And I know that that can be a lot easier said than done. And something else here is this concept of disenfranchised grief. which refers to grief that exists outside socially accepted norms. We have norms and hierarchies when people die and when people are grieving. In most cultures, we have those. And so I think it's important to keep in mind this concept of disenfranchised grief, because we are living in a time, as we've all talked about today, of very complicated loss. And some of those losses will be bereavements. People may feel quite disenfranchised by those in different ways. So I think that's a concept to keep in mind. And just before I finish, there is this idea, isn't there? The Prime Minister gave his speech yesterday. There is now this idea that we're bouncing back, that we're getting back to normal. And I wanted to frame that within, this is Dennis Klass, who's an American theorist, and he talks about continuing bonds after death, where he says that actually acceptance after significant death or loss is not ever fully achieved. We never get over it, as it were. It becomes part of something. We acclimatise to it and we wrap it into ourselves, and it becomes part of us. And similarly, Robert Nehmeyer, who's also an American theorist, he says that meaning making is the central process in grieving. So when we go through any significant loss or disruption or bereavement in our lives, our task in some way is to try and make meaning out of it. And I think that people have really reflected that in what they've talked about today, in the challenges that there have been to working digitally, but also in trying to see the positives in it. So what might we fold into ourselves from that? What might we take forward from what we've learned from this time? But I would say also, and this is only my view, this is from L.P. Hartley's book, The Go-Between, very famous quote where he says, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." I think we're adapting to a new normal. I don't think we're going back to normal, because I don't think that normal exists anymore. And I think that we have to be very careful, actually, in just rushing back into things. We need a collective pause for breath, is what I think, before we try and dash back into what was, because as I've said, that's no longer there. And we have to look after ourselves, but also to be aware that as many of us will know, COVID's deepened the divisions and the fissures and the inequalities that were there already, which means that many people are at risk of multiple losses from this pandemic. And I think we have to be really mindful of that as we move forward. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I put this up, it's a bit cheesy, but I think there is a sense in it in terms of what we've all been through under this pandemic as well. So thank you, and thank you very, very much for inviting me today.
Thank you very, very much, Denise. That was extremely thought-provoking, and I think I was very much struck, that we have rather glibly being told about the new normal, etc., but that actually what you present to us is actually what a challenge that is. How we have to face what we have lost, which is very painful indeed, not just our existential loss as professionals, but very real losses that we have to incorporate into the way in which we work if we are to move on and to innovate. And there is, of course, for all of us who lose, we want to get away from that pain. We want to write articles. We want to just develop new things rather than pause and reflect, so that we can move on in a truly meaningful way. And I wanted to thank you very much for reminding us of that.
Thank you.